In this video, I'm going to introduce the idea of scope. And so I'll talk about what scope is and then give you some examples of where it's used in JavaScript. So this video should give you a sense of why it's important to learn about scope, particularly if you're coming from a class-based language like C++ or Java. Scope deals with the lookup of variables. And so, for example, in this case, I have a function called add, and I have a variable here called b assigned to 20, and then up here I've got another variable called a assigned to 10, and then the add function just returns the result of adding a plus b. And the question is, where does the JavaScript runtime get the value for a and for the value for b? Now, down here, I have an immediately executing function, and the way that I get that immediately executing function, or in other words, a function that just runs and gets called right away, is by using this special syntax here. And inside of this function, I'm redefining a variable called a and assigning it to 20. So if I erase this and clear this up a little bit, I now have two variables called a. And the question is, when we call this add function here, which variable gets used, which value gets used for a? If you look over in the console, we can see the result is 30. And that's because the value of a that's being used is this value up here, not this value here. So the topic of scope deals with how JavaScript looks up this value and what path does it follow in order to get the value for this variable. This lookup process is very similar to the prototype property lookup process that we've studied already in the objects class. Let me introduce a little bit more vocabulary before we look at some patterns where understanding how this works is really useful. The first thing to note is in this example here, the reason that the value of a is 10 and not the value down here, 20, is because in JavaScript, our variables are lexically scoped. So if you see this vocabulary word, lexically scoped, you'll know by the end of this video series what that means. Another way of saying this is that it's statically scoped. In other words, it doesn't change. So what this means is that the binding here, or the scope, is created at the time that this function is created, and not when it's called, like down here. You'll see specifically what this means soon enough. Here's a bunch of examples of patterns that you'll see in frameworks over and over again, where understanding scoping will help you to understand what's actually happening. So let me show you these examples, and I'll also introduce a little bit of new vocabulary that you'll be hearing throughout the next couple of videos. In the first example, we've already talked about static scoping, and here's another example where the variable that's used here is the one that was visible at the time that the function was created, and so that's this one here. So it's static because it's at the time the function is created and it doesn't change. Down here, if we were able to change to a different variable x right before call time, we'd say that the scoping was dynamic. But in JavaScript, the scoping is static. So the value of x will be 10. Let's scroll down and take a look at closures. Closures are the idea of creating a new scope by creating a function and calling it. And so this variable here, x, is only visible inside of this function and any other functions that were created at this time. And so for this example, the foo and bar functions both are able to mutate and then return the value of this private variable. And that's because the baz function created a closure over everything inside of it. So we'll talk more about that when we get to closures. Now, the combination of closures and static scoping can be a little bit confusing. Here's an example of a function that won't work as expected. So in this case, we have an array data and we're looping from 0 to 3. And for each one, we're going to add something new to the data variable. And the function will just print to the console the value of k. And what we're hoping here is that k will be 1 and then 2 and then 3. But what will actually happen is that k will be bound to the last value of this loop, which will be 3. And so instead of this, we'll just see 3 functions that all print 3. So we can take advantage of the idea of closures and scope to make sure that the correct value of k gets bound to this function. This will make a lot more sense when we get into the details of scope and closures. Another example of scope and closures that are used all over the place is for binding functions. That's where we want to take an existing function, like say the sayHello function here, and bind it to a particular thisarg so that it doesn't change no matter where this function is passed around to. So what I can do is to call this special bind function that I created, passing in the function that I want to bind and then the object that I want to be the permanent thisarg. So that way, when I call the bound function, the thisarg is always this object here. And so over in the console, you can see that it says sayHello and then hello Chris. In this video, I introduced the idea of scope, and then I showed you a whirlwind tour of examples where scope is used for patterns that you'll see over and over again. Now, you can just memorize these patterns, but I think that if you get a good intuitive sense of how scope works, all of this code will make a lot more sense to you. I also introduced a little bit of new vocabulary, including scope, but also the word closure and static or lexically scoped versus dynamically scoped variables. In the next couple of videos, we'll dive in and see how this all works.